Hello, everyone, and welcome to Let's Review. Today, I want to talk about Notes from a Young Black Chef. I first read this book in 2022. I had recently started as an embedded tutor, which is another title for teaching assistant in my case. And this was one of the first books assigned to a class I was working with. I was definitely in a teacher mindset while looking at Notes from a Young Black Chef rather than approaching it really from like an enjoyer of the book. And that was probably because as an embedded tutor, I needed to create one or two workshops around it. And so I found myself being a lot more critical of the book as a whole. Part of the reason I want to talk about this book is that I recently came across it on my shelf. I had always planned to send it off to my best friend, who goes by Penna here on YouTube, and I plan to ship this to you. I promise it will eventually come. I say that because you're probably going to be editing this video. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope I would love to hear your thoughts at the end. So enough of my shout out to Penna. Let me just say I saw it again on my bookshelf and I decided to give it another reread and to do this review before I send it. And so that's kind of what's bringing me to talk about it today. Because while I was reading it the first time, I had come in with the mindset of that was like way more structured, with Thomas Foster's How to Read Nonfiction Like a Professor. And in that book, he says every book, every article, every column has a plan, even the ones that purport to have none. And with that in mind, I found myself paying particular attention to how Onwuachi structures his story and what he chooses to emphasize and what may be left out. The book is presented mostly in chronological order, following Unwachi's through childhood, through his culinary training and early successes, and then eventually his rise and fall as a restaurant owner and executive chef at Shah Bijou. And this straightforward structure makes the progression of his career really easy to follow, but it also reinforces one of the book's central patterns, which is that Umwachi repeatedly encounters a setback, recognizes that he needs to make a change in some way, and then finds himself repeating similar mistakes. Onwuachi seems to have written the book with the intention of showing someone overcoming challenges and learning from difficult experiences, kind of like, here's what I've learned, here's what you can learn from my experiences. And one of the things that kept sticking with me was a recurring idea or theme about paying your dues. I felt like it was particularly interesting to me because, many industries have this mentality. I've seen it several times in my own professional work. And it was this theme that I found myself increasingly hung up on and frustrated by in the way that Umachi presents himself. I kept thinking of Holden Caulfield from The Catcher in the Rye, although not necessarily in a flattering way. Like Holden, Unwachi often presents himself as someone who can see what is wrong with the people and systems around him. Unlike Caulfield, however, Unwachi is clearly talented and capable of achieving significant success. His problem is rarely a lack of ability. However, many of his biggest setbacks seem connected to his personality, particularly his ego and his desire to be in charge, which is very Caulfield-like. It happened several times in the novel, in a lot of these like big major moments, but I want to highlight actually the final chapter as a key moment that I think really hits this home. At the end of the book, after his restaurant fails, Unwachi is depressed and struggling. He has opportunities to get himself out of that situation through work offers that appear in his email inbox, but his response is mm, a little egotistical, writing things like consulting would be the easiest gig, that's a direct quote, which is, interesting to say when his restaurant had just failed, which is blamed on financial reasons. Um, and following that up with, quote, nah, that wasn't me either. If Bijou had taught me anything, it was that I relished being a leader in the kitchen, end quote. And that's on page 267. I feel like this moment is kind of the culmination of the book's lesson about paying your dues. Um, it he has not yet learned what he needs to learn, but he still wants to be um, in a position of authority. He has not yet paid his dues, I want to say, in the context of his own writing. In revisiting the book, I was trying to identify why I struggled with this so much in my first reading. And I was able to recall that because I had covered my first reading of the book in annotations. And I think it kind of stems from the part of the title, the quote notes, end quote. I expected the book to be more explicitly drawing on learning from mistakes, whether that's from one's own or from others, but instead it often felt like a repetition of the same realization. And Onwuachi recognizes that something needs to change, he starts to change and experiences success, but then he falls back into parts of his ego and habits as he fails to fully change and then experiences that failure in a professional sense or in a setback of some sort. The success is fast enough and significant enough that it outweighs those failures, but that also makes the pattern more complicated because it doesn't allow the lesson to fully stick with him between the experiences. He's very talented and has enough ambition and confidence that these elements really work for him, even when personality choices ultimately contribute to some of his setbacks and failures. In some of these experiences that Unwachi describes, it was reminding me of like kitchen nightmares and how often restaurants fail, including Gordon Ramsay, the host's first restaurant, which is something that Ramsay has discussed a few times over the several seasons of the show's run, that failure and setbacks happen, and to successfully move forward, you need to learn from them. And from this, I would say that I felt like Unwachi attempts to demonstrate that successes require hard work and patience and a willingness to learn before taking on positions of authority. But then in his own experiences and providing examples of what happens, he doesn't really fully learn that lesson or follow that lesson. The book, you know, has other techniques though that I guess I want to talk about, other things that I want to talk about. I especially liked that the recipes in the books break up the individual chapters. They provide a change of pace and they make the book feel much more connected to Nwachi's identity as a chef and not just his identity as a chef, but as a person. It really, I think, brings out a lot of the humanity. Which is so weird because it's like a cookbook element. And the writing is also really engaging because as a reader, you can see these brief shifts in Unwachi's confidence throughout the story, moments of doubt or vulnerability that often appear, and then sometimes get quickly replaced by like a renewed confidence and ego boost. And that contrast kept me really interested because it makes his personality itself one of the more central ideas of the book. It becomes the internal conflict with all of the external happening. I also found myself questioning what is being omitted from the story, particularly in the way that Unwachi describes his upbringing and financial circumstances. At times, his descriptions create an impression of significant or potential poverty and hardships, but the finer details, such as those about his mom's catering clients, the clothing brands, etc., read to me more as, if not upper middle class, maybe lower middle class than the book would sometimes seem to suggest. He may have been less financially well off than that of some of the people around him or his peers, and financial hardship is clearly a part of the storytelling. But I was left wondering whether the book sometimes emphasizes hardships that, um, are given less, you know, how do I put this? It's emphasizing hardships and thereby giving less attention to the advantages and opportunities that Unwachi did have, maybe in comparison to several of his peers. That distinction matters because the omission makes his personality seem like an even larger factor in these moments of setback and failure. If the circumstances surrounding his failures are presented primarily as the external obstacles, it becomes easier to see him as someone just overcoming adversity. But these smaller details are standing out because it kind of makes you notice that there's an omission happening. And it suggests that some advantages are not being acknowledged alongside the challenges. And that makes his repeated struggles with some ego and impatience and desire for control harder to overlook. Ultimately, though, I found that Notes from a Young Black Chef is really compelling. It's a little frustrating, but very compelling. Unwachi is very clearly talented, ambitious, and capable of extraordinary success, and the book does a good job of making his journey engaging. For me, I think the most interesting part of the book was not whether Unwachi could become successful, because clearly he could and can and does, but whether he will develop the self-awareness necessary to sustain that success. The book leaves that question a little bit more unsure. It's not really fully resolved, but a quick Google search told me that he has successfully opened a few more restaurants since Shot Bichot. And that, is something that I would definitely be interested in noting and prompting in a class discussion if I ever decided to use this book in my own teaching. Did I like the book? Yeah, I did. And I like it well enough that I definitely would recommend it. I'm planning, as I mentioned earlier, to send this to Wenna Penna, to add to her very long to be read book list. And then we'll see what happens from there. But if you have read the book, what are your thoughts? I'd love to hear from others on what their opinions were. If you've read the book, what did you think? Let me know in the comments below. And thank you so much for watching. Bye.